First, these poll numbers show Elizabeth Warren moving on up.
Yeah, let's get right into the Kornacki wheelhouse. These are some meaty new polls from NBC News and Wall Street Journal showing Elizabeth Warren inching closer to Joe Biden. The former vice president sits at 31%. He's up 5 points since July. Warren only 6 points behind, though, at 25%. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders a distant third with 14% in this poll. And most notably, perhaps, Senator Kamala Harris has fallen 8 points since July. She sits in 5th place with 5% of the vote. Biden reaches almost 50% support among black voters, while 28% of white voters back Warren's run. A third of young voters under 34 years old say they support Sanders, with Warren following as a close second in that group, whereas almost 50% of voters over 65 back Joe Biden. Liberal Democratic voters overwhelmingly support the Massachusetts senator's run. That's at 36% for Warren, while more than 40% of moderate and conservative Democrats polled say they back the former vice president. When it comes to the amount of change Democratic voters want to see, a majority who want to see large-scale change say they back Warren's run for the White House. And of those who prefer small-scale change, 43% support Biden. Meanwhile, Warren holds a 10-point lead among her fellow 2020 candidates when it comes to enthusiasm among Democratic primary voters. So, Steve, there's a ton in there, obviously. We'll go through all of it, but let's start with the top line, and that is Elizabeth Warren moving up right behind Joe Biden, although they're growing, actually, at the same rate. He's up 6, she's up 5.
Yeah, interesting. So why is Warren up? I think there's two things you see happening in that poll. Number one is we've talked about, look, Warren and Sanders, they've been sort of battling for second. They have similar messages. They actually have there's some pretty significant differences in their bases, but I think one thing you're seeing in this poll is the areas where there have been overlap in Warren and Sanders supporting. Right now, at least in this poll, Warren now starting to get the better of Sanders. So that's one thing to look at going forward. Is there separation? Is Warren attaining separation from Sanders for second place? The other reason I think Warren's been able to move up, and you mentioned it, Kamala Harris back down at 5%. I think Warren's clearly been the beneficiary of that drop-off for Harris. I think also most significantly going forward, I think you put that split up there, that racial split, that white-black split. Warren is doing significantly better with white voters than she is with black voters. However, that 13% number she now has with black voters, that was like 3, 4, 5 a couple months ago. So that is substantial, I think significant, I should say, that she is moving into double digits there. And you start to see, when you put on the screen right there, when you put those side to side, you start to see what Warren's campaign believes the path is, because think of the calendar next year. Iowa, New Hampshire, 90+% white states. There's Warren leading among white voters right now, doing particularly well among activists, among liberal voters, folks who are going to turn out in caucuses next year. We have seen this formula before in the Democratic primaries. I can remember John Kerry in 2004. He was running about 10% with black voters. He won Iowa. He won New Hampshire. The next thing you know, he's won 56% of the black vote. So the fact that Warren has started to get a little bit of traction with black voters, she's leading among white voters. You see at least a potential path for her there that is, hey, if you can do well, if you can break through in Iowa and New Hampshire, you can grow that black support very quickly, potentially.
I think we picked up on the same thing there, which is that Joe Biden is the front runner, full stop, still strong, still growing, despite shaky debate performances, 3 of them now. But when you look among African-American voters, particularly in the state of South Carolina, where he has such a commanding lead, we've got a new poll this morning that shows Iowa neck and neck between Biden and Warren. So to your point, if you game it out, let's say she wins Iowa somehow, you'll see those numbers move in South Carolina.
And this is the challenge for Biden. I think this is potentially the biggest problem for him. Again, his strongest source of support, you say it, it's African-American voters. You got to think about the South Carolina primary there. And the question is, can he survive to South Carolina? Because look at the calendar again. If Elizabeth Warren, for that matter, you could say Bernie Sanders too, or somebody else, if Elizabeth Warren were to win Iowa, it's 8 days between Iowa and New Hampshire. And Elizabeth Warren is a next-door neighbor senator. The track record of Massachusetts candidates winning New Hampshire primaries is very good, especially if they come in having won the Iowa caucuses. And the track record of candidates who win both Iowa and New Hampshire, when they've both been contested in the modern era, basically undefeated when that happens. So the question is, yeah, sure, Biden right now, extremely strong support with black voters. That positions him very well in South Carolina. You can talk about South South Carolina as a potential firewall, but we have not seen in the past Southern and South Carolina firewalls hold up when candidates have lost both Iowa and New Hampshire. That's the challenge for him. He's got to find a win there.
Before we move on, I want to get to Shannon, Jason, and Donnie on these polls really quickly. Shannon, first of all, is this a two-person race at this point? Is this Biden and Warren? What's happening to the rest of the field?
I know, that's what I'm asking myself. I've this entire time thought we were going to see a three-person race.
Right.
We would see an establishment candidate, Biden. We would see the sort of far left wing with a Sanders or a Warren, and then we would have the insurgency candidate, the youthful new voice in the party. Maybe Buttigieg seems to be the only one who's still hanging in there.
Right.
But we've had 3 debates now, a lot of hours of debate time. No one seems to be emerging, and it seems instead of that pack going to one of the other third candidates, they are just, as you said, Kamala people are moving to Warren. Right. Beto people are moving to Biden, and we're seeing them go to the top tier.
So we're down to 2 potentially. It might be too early to tell, but Jason, Elizabeth Warren definitely moving on up, but she's got some major hurdles. Can she overcome them? What are they?
Well, so the first major hurdle she has is Joe Biden, because he's the front runner. People still think he's the most electable. He is still the candidate that is the top second choice for a lot of people like Elizabeth Warren, a lot of people like Bernie Sanders. But here's where her successes come in. Number one, and I've been saying this for a while, she began with activist black women. That started with She the People several months ago. And activist African-American women have drawn more black voters to Elizabeth Warren, which has been helpful. Next, she's been taking away the progressives and the activists from the Bernie Sanders campaign. She just won the Working Families Party endorsement this week. That was something that Bernie Sanders had locked down in 2016. Now Elizabeth Warren has it, and it's a very, very strong endorsement of black, brown, tan, and working class people, and they will work for you across the country. So she's doing well. If she can convince people that she is electable, if she can convince people, in recent polls, there's an article in Slate that said if you take electability out of it, Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden are almost tied. If she can make that argument nationally, this is a two-person race.
All right, so here's a number all the candidates will like. Only 9% of Democratic voters say they've made up their mind. So that's good. But Donnie Deutsch, I'm going to ask the mean question, but it's worth asking. You see Elizabeth Warren, 1 a.m., 12:30 a.m., taking selfies in a line of 20,000 people, every last person, her arms in the air, fit, happy, totally loving it. And Biden, you don't see that. Is there a concern at this point that people are looking at, or is this just in the media?
Well, that would line up with the enthusiasm number, which to me is always a really important number, which goes right to Warren. Look, it is a two-person race, and we've got to stop lumping Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in the same place. Elizabeth Warren has clearly established herself as the liberal alternative, and it's going to be interesting to see how those numbers change when we get to a binary place. And the binary place is going to be very, very simple. Do you go from the instability of Trump to something that is potentially unstable but interesting and more proactive and more progressive? Or do you go from instability to stability, to kind of neutral, if you will? I mean, the very thing that people put Biden down about is might be the very, very tonic
comfort level
that people are looking for now, and that's going to be the injury. I think we're going to see that very quickly when it gets down to 2, and it's a real guttural thing. Do I want to go from one side of the axis to the other side?
Right.
Well, just put me in the middle. Let's take a little time out and we'll regroup.
I'll get to David in just a second, but let me ask you, Steve and Jason, the Kamala Harris question. A candidate who excited a lot of people when she announced, who did very well in the first debate and had a spike in the polls. How do you explain her fall to 5%, where she's now sort of in the Andrew Yang group?
Yeah, well, look, I think back to that first debate and what worked for her there. That was a pretty clearly premeditated, sort of rehearsed moment. And you think about her training as a prosecutor. That's somebody who, when she can prepare for it, when she can prepare for all the contingencies and sort of rehearse ahead of time, she could pull off that line, pull off that moment. She did that in the first debate. I think where she struggled in this campaign, and we've seen this consistently, is when she's been hit with something she wasn't necessarily expecting, a question she wasn't necessarily expecting at a town hall, an attack from a rival. I'm thinking of Tulsi Gabbard in the second debate. She wasn't necessarily preparing for. I think we've seen her a little less sure of herself on her feet in those settings. I suspect that's come across to voters. Clearly, she's had the opportunity. The fact that she was able to pop her poll numbers after that first debate shows she's had the opportunity to move those numbers forward to. But except for that 10-day window around that first debate when she did, there really has been no traction. The only traction we've seen has been backwards for her.
Jason, smart, talented, experienced, likable. How do you explain it?
Well, a couple things. First, she's kind of the Marco Rubio of this race, right? She checks off every single box. Everyone assumed she would be more successful, but she had to connect with people. There was a woman who I talked to in Georgia who said, an African-American woman, professional. I said, look, what do you think of Kamala Harris? Why do you think she's been following? And she said she kind of reminds me of a mixture between like Meghan Markle and Hillary Clinton. Like she's fashionable and she's interesting, but I don't know if I really believe in her. I don't know if I really trust her laughter. And as people got to know Senator Harris, they always thought that she was competent, but did they think that she could bring crowds of people? Did they think that she could bring a level of enthusiasm? I have met Senator Harris. I have seen her speak. She doesn't have the enthusiasm level, even amongst her supporters, that Elizabeth Warren did. So I think as this race went on, she was always going to run into the challenge of, can you light up that audience the same way? The fact that she is now behind Pete Buttigieg is a major blow on her campaign.
So, David Drucker, the big question is who can beat Donald Trump, and I think that question is right up against Elizabeth Warren, because if you look at these numbers and the voters who are drawn to her, they're not people who are ever going to vote for Trump, and there are people who have voted for Trump who might vote for Biden. Isn't Biden there the resounding challenger when it comes to beating Donald Trump?
Well, I think when you talk to Republican insiders and Republican voters, I think Joe Biden is clearly the Democrat that they fear. And I think a lot of this, Amika, has to do with the fact that Elizabeth Warren is offering a very disruptive campaign. And the question is, can you beat disruption with disruption? And for a lot of voters, there's a question about whether or not Elizabeth Warren can beat President Trump in the right places. Look, she clearly is going to have a lot of appeal in left-leaning suburbs and even some of the swing suburbs. But in a lot of these swing counties, in exurban and rural counties where the president has been really strong and eaten into what was long a Democratic-dominated area, does she have, because of her cultural politics, not so much because of her left-wing populism, which could have some appeal, but because of her position on cultural issues, can she eat into the president's margins there? I think there's a huge question mark around that. And somebody like Joe Biden, who, because he is not seen as so disruptive, but is seen as somebody who has been around for so long, it's somebody that may be a little bit too liberal for me, but maybe somebody that I can deal with, that makes me feel comfortable. And maybe I'm somebody who's not even that comfortable with the president's disruption, even if I like his issues, and Biden's a comfortable place to go. I think that's why we see him doing better in these areas. That's why Republicans fear him the most. And so I think that's the question Elizabeth Warren has to answer. Now, I will say this, and this is really important. When you talk to Elizabeth Warren's supporters, even though they're not those kind of voters, at least not yet, they really believe in her electability. And it's a very dangerous thing when you have a candidate whose voters really believe that that candidate can win. We saw that with President Trump, and it was a real killer for him.
But that's the problem. You know, here's a simple problem, and Joe brought it up yesterday. If she's going to continue along saying to 160 million people, you can't choose your insurance, she's going to lose.
I know.
She's going to lose. I mean, like, we got to grow up a little bit around here sometimes. Her policies, now she may be just playing a game, and once she gets in the general election, but if she's running on her policies, and she seems to be someone who's pretty authentic, she will lose, and we'll get 4 more years of Donald Trump. I know it's not popular, a lot of people, when I say that. That's a fact.
She's already on the record, and she's sponsored a bill, so she can't run away from that. It's already there.
Lots more to get to.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.